Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to Victorian London, 1880. The air smells of coal smoke and horse manure, and somewhere in Whitehall, in a wood-panelled office with gaslight flickering against mahogany, a young man is copying letters for a government minister. His handwriting is perfect. His suit is well-tailored, but not expensive. He lives in rooms his employer pays for. He dines at his employer's table. He travels with him to country estates. He knows every secret the man holds. And at night, when the household is asleep, he slips down the hall to a bedroom that is not his own. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In 1884, in a townhouse on Park Lane, a man named Montague Williams was writing his memoirs. Williams had been a magistrate, a barrister, a man who had seen the underside of London society for decades. And in his book, published that year, he described a phenomenon that polite society pretended not to notice. He called them gentlemen's companions. Young men, usually from respectable but poor families, who attached themselves to wealthy or powerful men. They lived in the patron's household. They managed his correspondence. They accompanied him everywhere. And, Williams wrote with careful phrasing, they enjoyed privileges that raised certain questions. Williams did not spell out what those questions were. He did not need to. Everyone knew. To understand why no one spoke plainly, you have to understand something the history books rarely explain. Victorian society had perfected the art of the open secret. And no open secret was more open or more secret than the intimate arrangements between powerful men and their young male secretaries. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to London. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know the name of a Prime Minister's secretary who was caught with love letters in a locked desk, why a foreign secretary's household staff testified about bedroom arrangements in court, and what really happened when a young man named Alfred Taylor kept a list of every politician who visited his rooms after midnight. The thing about being a Victorian gentleman's secretary is that the job description never quite matched the reality. On paper, you were hired to manage correspondence, to keep the diary, to draft replies, to maintain the filing system, to ensure that when your employer needed a document, a date, a name, or a fact, you could produce it instantly. In practice, you were something else entirely. You were a companion, a confidant, a shadow. You knew which letters your employer wanted his wife to see and which ones you should burn after reading. You knew which dinner invitations he would accept and which he would decline with elaborate excuses that you composed. You knew when to leave him alone and when your presence was required. And if you were the right kind of young man, well born enough to move in society but poor enough to need the position, handsome enough to ornament a drawing room, and discreet enough to keep your mouth shut, you knew one more thing. You knew which bedroom door to try after the house went dark. Let me introduce you to someone who lived this exactly. His name was John Addington Symonds. And before he became one of Victorian England's most important writers on homosexuality, before he wrote the essays that would shape how we understand queer history, before any of that, he was 23 years old, newly graduated from Oxford, and desperate for a position that would let him stay close to the man he loved. The year was 1863. Symonds had spent his Oxford years in a state of near constant agony. He was brilliant. Everyone agreed on that. He had won the Newdigate Prize for poetry. He was handsome, well-connected, articulate. He should have had the world ahead of him. But John Addington Symonds had a problem that no amount of brilliance could solve. He was in love with a chorister named Willie Dyer. Dyer was 16, blonde, from a poor family. He sang like an angel, and Symonds had written him letters that could have gotten them both destroyed. The letters were not explicit. Symonds was too careful for that. But they were intense, passionate, the kind of letters that, if discovered, required no interpretation. Symonds knew he needed to marry, knew he needed a position, knew he needed to construct a life that looked, from the outside, like the life a man of his class was supposed to live. And so he accepted an offer from a man named Frederick Harrison. Harrison was a barrister, a scholar, and a positivist philosopher. He was also, conveniently, setting up a household in London and needed someone to manage his papers. The position came with rooms in Harrison's home, meals at Harrison's table, access to Harrison's library. It was on paper the perfect arrangement for a young scholar, and it was also, though neither man ever said it plainly, an arrangement that required Symonds to live in close domestic proximity to an older man who found his company indispensable. Harrison was not Symonds's lover. The historical record is quite clear on that. But the structure of the arrangement, the young man living in the household, the shared meals, the long evenings in the study, the fact that Symonds travelled with Harrison to conferences and country visits, that structure was identical to dozens of other secretary-patron relationships where the line between professional and personal had blurred into non-existence. Symonds lasted 6 months. He left Harrison's household in 1864, citing his health. He married a woman named Catherine North later that year. He spent the next 2 decades of his life writing, in coded language, about the love that he could not live openly. And in his private journals, rediscovered decades after his death, he described those 6 months with Harrison as some of the loneliest of his life. Not because Harrison mistreated him, not because the work was unbearable, but because he had been living in a household structure designed for intimacy, surrounded by the trappings of domestic partnership, and had none of the intimacy he needed. He had been a secretary, not a companion. And the difference, for men like Symonds, was everything. The Victorian era invented the modern concept of the private secretary as we know it. Before the 1830s, most gentlemen managed their own correspondence or relied on family members. But as the machinery of government and business grew more complex, as men accumulated more responsibilities, more social engagements, more political entanglements, someone had to manage the paperwork. Enter the private secretary. By 1850, every man of importance had one. Statesmen had them, aristocrats had them, bishops had them, wealthy industrialists had them. The private secretary was part of the furniture of upper-class life, as essential as a valet and considerably more powerful. Because the valet knew what you wore, the secretary knew what you thought, and if you were a man whose thoughts included desires you could not safely express, well, the secretary knew that too. Let me give you a sense of what this looked like in practice. Picture a townhouse in Belgravia, 1875. 5 stories, white stone facade, black iron railings. The master of the house is a member of Parliament. Let us call him Sir Edmund, though we will meet men with real names soon enough. Sir Edmund is 52, a widower, respected in his party, known for his work on colonial policy. Sir Edmund's day begins at 8. His valet dresses him, his housekeeper oversees breakfast, and his secretary, a young man named Charles, 26, Oxford-educated, son of a country vicar, arrives in the study at 8:30 with the morning's letters already sorted into 3 piles. Pile 1, urgent political correspondence requiring Sir Edmund's immediate attention. Pile 2, social invitations, charitable requests, letters from constituents. Pile 3, personal letters, which Charles has not opened but has recognised by the handwriting. Charles knows which letters in pile 3 Sir Edmund will want to read alone. He has learned this by observation, by noting which envelopes Sir Edmund slips into his desk drawer, which ones he burns in the fireplace after reading. Charles never asks about these letters. That is not his job. His job is to know without asking. By 9, Charles has drafted replies to pile 2. Sir Edmund reviews them, makes minor edits, signs. Charles seals them, arranges for their posting. He updates the engagement diary. He confirms that the carriage will be ready at 11 for Sir Edmund's meeting at the Foreign Office. At 10, a visitor arrives unannounced. A young man, well-dressed, nervous. He asks to see Sir Edmund privately. Charles shows him into the study and closes the door. He does not listen at the door. He does not need to. He knows that this young man has visited twice before, always unannounced, always asking for privacy. He knows that after the first visit, Sir Edmund was distracted for days. He knows that after the second visit, Sir Edmund gave him a sealed letter and told him to post it personally, to tell no one. Charles is not a fool. He knows what these visits mean, and because he is a good secretary, because his job depends on his discretion, he ensures that the housekeeper is busy elsewhere, that the footman is sent on an errand, that no one will interrupt, that no one will see the young man leave. This is the service a private secretary provides. Not typing, not filing, plausible deniability. The young man leaves after 20 minutes. Sir Edmund emerges from the study looking composed. He asks Charles to arrange a late supper that evening, in the study, for 2. He does not say who the second person will be. Charles nods. He informs the cook. He ensures that the supper will be brought up on trays, that the staff will not need to enter the study once the trays are delivered. At midnight, long after the household has gone to bed, Charles is still awake in his own rooms, 2 floors up, a small bedroom and a sitting room, comfortable but not lavish. He hears footsteps on the stairs, a door opening and closing quietly. The young man has returned. Charles does not leave his room, does not investigate. In the morning, he will come down to the study and find 2 plates, 2 glasses, evidence of a long evening. He will remove the trays himself before the housemaid arrives. He will place a fresh decanter of brandy in the study, will ensure that the room looks exactly as it should, and he will never, ever mention that anyone visited. This is what it meant to be a private secretary to a Victorian gentleman. You were not a servant. Servants could be dismissed, replaced, were not privy to confidences. You were not family. Family could judge, could interfere, could create scandal. You were something in between. A professional intimate. A keeper of secrets who was not quite a friend and not quite an employee. And if you were young and handsome, and the gentleman in question had certain inclinations, the line between secretary and something else could dissolve entirely. Now let me tell you about a man who crossed that line so thoroughly that it destroyed him. His name was Alfred Taylor. And if you have heard of him at all, it is probably because of Oscar Wilde. But before Taylor became the man who introduced Wilde to the young men who would ruin him, before he stood trial alongside Wilde in 1895, before any of that, Alfred Taylor was exactly the kind of young man who might have become someone's private secretary if his life had gone differently. Taylor was born in 1862, the son of a wealthy cocoa manufacturer. He was educated well. He had an inheritance. He had, in his early 20s, every advantage a young man could want. And then he discovered that he preferred the company of young working-class men to the company of respectable society. He took rooms in Westminster at 13 Little College Street. He furnished them expensively. He kept the curtains drawn at all hours. He burned perfumed candles. And he kept a visitor's book. Taylor's rooms became, over the course of the early 1890s, a sort of unofficial club. Young men came and went at all hours. Some of them were actors, some were clerks, some had no profession at all. They drank Taylor's wine, smoked his cigarettes, and met the gentleman Taylor introduced them to. Because Taylor's real function, the service he provided, was introductions. If you were a man of a certain class, with certain desires, and you did not know where to meet young men safely, you went to Alfred Taylor. Taylor knew everyone. He could arrange meetings. He could provide rooms. He could ensure discretion. He was, in essence, performing the same function a private secretary performed, managing the delicate social and logistical arrangements that allowed powerful men to live double lives. Except Taylor was not employed by one man. he was freelance. And that made all the difference. Because when Oscar Wilde was arrested in 1895 and the police searched for evidence, they found Alfred Taylor. They found his visitor's book. They found letters. They found a network. And they found names. The prosecutor at Wilde's trial described Taylor as the centre of a web. Young men testified that Taylor had introduced them to gentlemen, had arranged meetings, had provided rooms. The gentlemen themselves were not named in court. Most of them were too powerful, too well connected. Their privacy was protected, but Taylor was not protected. He was tried alongside Wilde, convicted, sentenced to 2 years hard labour. And here is the detail that should break your heart. Taylor never gave up the names. He was offered a deal. The prosecution told him that if he testified against Wilde, if he provided the names of the other gentlemen who had visited his rooms, his sentence would be reduced. Taylor refused. He served the full 2 years. He was released in 1897, his health destroyed. He died in 1950, 71 years old, having never spoken publicly about the names in his book. The private secretaries whose names were in that book, the young men who had served as companions, as confidants, as lovers to members of Parliament, to barristers, to men whose reputations could not be touched, they were never called to testify. Their employers made sure of it, because that was the entire point of the arrangement. The secretary's discretion protected the gentleman, and the gentleman's power protected the secretary, unless the secretary made a mistake, unless he kept a list, unless he became, himself, too visible. Then the protection evaporated, and the secretary discovered that he had never been a partner. He had been a buffer, a layer of insulation between the gentleman and the consequences of his desires. Alfred Taylor learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but not every private secretary was as reckless as Taylor. Most of them understood the rules. They lived within the structure. They took what intimacy they could, and they kept their mouths shut. And some of them, a very few, managed to build lives that looked, from the outside, almost like partnerships. Let me tell you about one of those. His name was Edward Carpenter, and his story is different. Carpenter was born in 1844 into a middle-class family in Brighton. He went to Cambridge. He was ordained as a deacon in the Church of England. He was, by every measure, on track for a respectable clerical career. And then, in his late 20s, he realised he could not bear it. He left the church in 1874. He moved to the north of England and became a lecturer for the University Extension movement, teaching literature and philosophy to working-class students. And in 1877, he met a young man named George Merrill. Merrill was everything Carpenter was not. Working class, uneducated, rough around the edges. He had grown up in the slums of Sheffield. He had worked in factories since he was a child, and Carpenter fell in love with him. They could not live together openly, not in the 1870s, not as equals. So Carpenter did what many men in his position did. He employed Merrill. Officially, Merrill was Carpenter's servant, his housekeeper, his handyman. In practice, they were partners. Carpenter bought a small cottage in Millthorpe, outside Sheffield. He and Merrill lived there together for nearly 40 years. They grew vegetables. They kept bees. They hosted visitors, writers, activists, socialists, feminists, anyone interested in Carpenter's ideas about sex and society. And everyone who visited understood, without it being said, that Merrill was not just the housekeeper. Carpenter wrote about this openly, well, as openly as the law allowed. In his book, The Intermediate Sex, published in 1908, he described relationships between men of different classes as a natural and valuable form of love. He called them comrade relationships. He argued that they were based on mutual affection, not exploitation. He was writing about himself and Merrill. Everyone knew it. But because Merrill was officially Carpenter's employee, because the relationship had the structure of master and servant, it was legally untouchable. This was the loophole. This was how some men survived. You could not live openly with a male lover. That was illegal, dangerous, subject to blackmail and prosecution, but you could employ a young man. You could share a household with him. You could travel with him, dine with him, share your life with him. As long as the paperwork said secretary or servant or companion, you were safe. The Victorians understood this perfectly. They did not talk about it, but they understood. And so the private secretary became, for a certain kind of man, the closest thing to a husband the law allowed. The most famous example of this arrangement, the one that everyone whispered about but no one could prove, involved a man you have definitely heard of. His name was William Ewart Gladstone, 4-time Prime Minister of Britain, the grand old man of Victorian politics. A man whose moral righteousness was so famous, it became a joke. Gladstone was the man who would interrupt cabinet meetings to discuss theology, who read Homer in the original Greek for relaxation, who believed deeply, publicly, exhaustingly, in the moral improvement of the poor. And Gladstone had a habit that baffled his friends and terrified his political enemies. He walked the streets of London at night, approaching young women who worked as prostitutes, and invited them back to his home for tea and moral instruction. This is documented. Gladstone kept meticulous diaries. He recorded these encounters. He called it rescue work. His wife knew about it. His colleagues knew about it. And everyone in London society understood that it was deeply, dangerously strange. A man of Gladstone's power and position, walking the streets after midnight, bringing vulnerable young women into his private study, closing the door. The potential for scandal was enormous. The potential for blackmail was worse. So how did Gladstone get away with it for 40 years? His private secretaries made it possible. Gladstone employed a succession of young men as private secretaries throughout his political career. The most important of them, the one who stayed longest, who knew the most, who managed the most delicate aspects of Gladstone's private life, was a man named Edward Walter Hamilton. Hamilton entered Gladstone's service in 1873 when he was 23 years old. He stayed for 12 years. He lived in Gladstone's household. He managed Gladstone's correspondence, his schedule, his political arrangements. He travelled with Gladstone to Balmoral to visit the Queen. He dined with Gladstone's family, and he accompanied Gladstone on the nighttime walks. Hamilton's diaries, discovered decades after his death, reveal what this actually looked like. On a typical evening, Gladstone would finish his parliamentary work around 10. He would have supper, and then he would turn to Hamilton and say, quietly, that he intended to take a walk. Hamilton would fetch his coat. They would leave the house together, walk through Mayfair, down into Soho, into the streets where women stood in doorways. Gladstone would approach them. Hamilton would stand a discreet distance away, watching. If a woman agreed to come back to the house, and some did, because Gladstone was famous and his offer of tea and money was genuine, Hamilton would walk slightly ahead, ensuring that the route back was clear, that no journalists were lurking, that no one who might cause trouble saw them. Back at the house, Hamilton would settle the woman in a downstairs room, ensure she had tea, ensure she was comfortable. Gladstone would speak with her privately, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Hamilton never recorded what was said in those meetings. When the woman left, Hamilton would see her out. Often, he would give her money from his own pocket, in addition to whatever Gladstone had given her. And then he would return to the study, where Gladstone would be on his knees praying, and Hamilton would quietly resume work on the correspondence that had been interrupted. This happened dozens of times, possibly hundreds, and Edward Hamilton never once broke Gladstone's confidence. But Hamilton's diaries reveal something else, something the official biographies of Gladstone tend to skip over. Hamilton was in love with Gladstone, not sexually, or if sexually, Hamilton never admitted it, even to his private diary, but emotionally, completely, painfully. He described Gladstone as the great man of my life. He wrote about Gladstone's hands, his voice, the way he looked when he was thinking. He wrote about the agony of watching Gladstone's health decline. He wrote about lying awake at night, worrying about Gladstone's reputation. When Hamilton finally left Gladstone's service in 1885, not because he wanted to, but because he was offered a major position at the Treasury that he could not refuse. He described it as the worst day of his life. He continued to visit Gladstone regularly. He continued to manage aspects of Gladstone's private affairs unofficially. When Gladstone died in 1898, Hamilton was at the bedside. And here is what you need to understand. Hamilton was not unique. This was the emotional structure of the private secretary relationship. Intense, intimate, unequal, and almost never openly acknowledged. The secretary lived in a state of permanent longing. Close enough to the great man to see him at his most human. Close enough to touch, but never touching. Trusted with everything except the one thing he wanted most. To be seen as an equal. For some secretaries, this was bearable. They took the intimacy they could get. They built careers on the proximity to power. For others, it was slow torture. And for a few, the longing turned into something else entirely. Let me tell you about Arthur Somerset. Somerset was not a secretary. He was the son of a duke, far too aristocratic for that kind of work. But his story intersects with the world of secretaries in a way that reveals how the whole system actually functioned. In 1889, Somerset was 40 years old and held the position of extra equerry to the Prince of Wales, essentially a gentleman companion to the future King Edward VII. It was a ceremonial role. Somerset's real job was to be decorative, amusing, and discreet about the prince's many affairs. And then the police raided a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street in London. The brothel had been operating for years. The clients were aristocrats, politicians, military men. The young men who worked there were mostly telegraph boys from the post office, teenagers, working class, who supplemented their income by entertaining gentlemen in the upstairs rooms. The police found appointment books, they found letters, and they found Arthur Somerset's name. The scandal should have destroyed everyone involved. Multiple members of Parliament were clients, several military officers, at least 2 men with direct connections to the royal household. But here is what actually happened. The young telegraph boys were prosecuted. 2 of them went to prison. The brothel keeper fled to France, and every single one of the aristocratic clients escaped. Arthur Somerset was warned by his friend, the Prince of Wales's private secretary, that a warrant was about to be issued for his arrest. He was given time to leave the country. He fled to France, where he lived in comfortable exile for the rest of his life, funded by a generous allowance from his family. The other clients, whose names were in the same appointment book, were never publicly identified, because their private secretaries had gotten to the evidence first. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the history books. When the police raided Cleveland Street, they seized papers. But between the raid and the trial, several documents went missing. Letters vanished. Pages were removed from the appointment book. Who removed them? The police never said. But everyone involved in the case understood what had happened. Powerful men had sent their secretaries, the young men who managed their correspondence, who knew which documents were dangerous, who had access to government offices and police files, to make the evidence disappear. And the secretaries had done it, because that was the job. You protected your employer, even if it meant destroying evidence, even if it meant watching working-class boys go to prison for the same acts your employer had paid them to perform. The Cleveland Street scandal revealed the truth about the Victorian system. The law existed to punish the powerless. The powerful had secretaries. Let us talk about what it actually felt like to live this way. Imagine you are 25 years old, Oxford, educated, the younger son of a country rector, respectable family, no money. You have taken a position as private secretary to a man I will call Lord H. Lord H is 56, a Liberal MP, a widower. He has a large house in Knightsbridge and a country estate in Wiltshire. He is charming, cultivated, interested in art and literature. He chose you personally from among several candidates because, he said, you reminded him of someone he knew at Cambridge. You have been in his employment for 8 months. Your rooms are on the 3rd floor of the Knightsbridge house. Bedroom, sitting room, a small study. The furniture is good quality. You have your own bookshelf, your own desk, a view of the square. The servants treat you with a deference that makes it clear you are not one of them. You dine with Lord H most evenings, unless he has guests. The work itself is not difficult. You manage correspondence, maintain the diary, draft speeches. Lord H trusts your judgment. He has begun asking your opinion on political matters. He introduces you to his colleagues as my indispensable Mr. So-and-so. You are aware that you are being groomed for something. A position in the civil service, perhaps. A parliamentary seat, if you are very lucky. Lord H has connections. He has mentioned, more than once, that he sees great potential in you. And then one evening in late October, Lord H asks you to stay after dinner. The servants have cleared the table. It is just the two of you in the dining room, the candles burning low. He pours you brandy. He asks about your family, your childhood, whether you were happy at Oxford. You answer carefully. You are always careful around Lord H. You sense that he is testing you, though you are not sure for what. He tells you a story about his own time at Cambridge, about a friend he had, how close they were, how they spent every evening together, reading poetry, walking by the river, how devastated he was when the friend died of scarlet fever just after graduation. He says, I have never found that kind of friendship again. Until perhaps now. You do not know what to say. Your heart is beating very fast. Lord H stands. He says, walk with me. You follow him out of the dining room, through the hall, up the stairs, not to the study, not to the drawing room, to his bedroom. He closes the door behind you. He says, you understand that what happens in this house stays in this house. You nod. You do understand. You have understood for weeks, though you have not let yourself think about it directly. He says, I am very fond of you. He does not touch you. Not yet. He is waiting to see what you will do. And here is your choice. You can leave. You can go back to your rooms, pack your things in the morning, resign politely. You will lose the position. You will lose the salary. You will lose the connections the future Lord H has been arranging for you. You will have to start again somewhere else, with no reference, because Lord H will not give you one if you leave this way. Or you can stay. You stay. That night, and the nights after, you learn the unwritten rules of the arrangement. You do not speak about it during the day. You do not presume on Lord H's affection in front of others. In public, you remain the secretary, deferential, professional, invisible. In private, you are something else. Not quite a lover, Lord H does not use that word. Not quite a companion. That would imply equality. You are his, in a way that has no name. The household staff know. Of course they know. But they do not speak of it, because their positions depend on discretion, just as yours does. Lord H's political colleagues know or suspect, but they do not ask, because most of them have similar arrangements. You tell yourself it is not so bad. The work is interesting. The life is comfortable. Lord H is kind to you most of the time. He buys you clothes, books, small gifts. He takes you to the country estate for weekends. He introduces you to important people. You tell yourself you are fortunate. And then one afternoon, you are walking through St. James's Park, and you see a young man your own age walking with an older gentleman. The same configuration, secretary and employer, obvious to anyone who knows how to look. The young man's face is carefully blank. And you recognize that blankness because you have practiced it in the mirror. You wonder if he tells himself he is fortunate too. You wonder how many of you there are. How many young men living in the third-floor rooms of powerful men's houses, managing correspondence by day and providing comfort by night. Dozens, certainly, possibly hundreds. And none of you will ever speak about it, because the moment you do, the protection evaporates. This was the contract. Intimacy in exchange for silence. Proximity to power in exchange for invisibility. Some men found it unbearable and left. Walked away from the position, the salary, the future, because the cost was too high. Others stayed for decades, built entire lives around the arrangement, retired with pensions, with gifts of money or property, with the satisfaction of having been indispensable to a great man. And a few, a very few, tried to break the contract. They wrote letters that were too explicit. They made demands. They threatened to speak publicly if their employer withdrew support. Those men discovered that the system had ways of dealing with breaches. Let me tell you what happened to a man named George Lewis. Lewis was not a secretary. He was a solicitor, one of the most powerful in London, whose entire practice was built on managing scandals for aristocratic clients. But his files, preserved in archives, reveal exactly how the secretary system was enforced. In 1893, a young man we will call Mr. S came to Lewis's office. Mr. S had been private secretary to a prominent Conservative politician for 3 years. The relationship had been intimate. The politician had made promises, had told Mr. S that he would be provided for, that when the time came for Mr. S to marry and start his own household, there would be a generous settlement. But then the politician had decided to end the arrangement. He had met someone else, a younger secretary. He had dismissed Mr. S with 1 month's wages and no reference. Mr. S was desperate. He had letters, passionate letters the politician had written to him. He told George Lewis that he intended to publish them unless the politician honoured his promises. Lewis listened carefully. He made notes. He asked to see the letters. Mr. S handed them over. And that was his mistake. Lewis did not represent Mr. S. Lewis represented the politician. Mr. S had misunderstood who was the client. Lewis kept the letters. He informed the politician that the situation was contained. And then he did something that his files record with bureaucratic precision. He arranged for Mr. S to be offered a position abroad, a clerical job in India, decent salary, leaving in 2 weeks. Mr. S was told that if he did not take the position, information about his proclivities would be shared with other potential employers. He would never work in London again. Mr. S took the job. He sailed for Bombay in November 1893. The letters were destroyed, and the politician continued his career without interruption. He brought a new young secretary into the household within a month. This is how the system protected itself. Not through affection, not through loyalty, through leverage. The private secretary had access to secrets, but the employer had access to power, and power, in Victorian England, always won, unless the secretary had something the employer could not afford to lose. Let me tell you about a case where that almost happened. The year is 1891. The place is Dublin Castle, the centre of British government in Ireland. The man at the centre of the scandal is James Ellis French, private secretary to the Earl of Zetland, who served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. French was 32. He had been in Zetland's service for 6 years. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily competent. He managed sensitive political correspondence during a period when Ireland was on the edge of rebellion. He was trusted with state secrets. He was also, according to testimony that emerged later, lovers with a young man named Thomas Murphy. Murphy was a clerk in the castle administration, 24 years old, from a Catholic family in Cork. He had come to Dublin looking for work and had been introduced to French by, this detail matters, another private secretary. French and Murphy were discreet. They met in Murphy's lodgings, not at the castle. They were careful. But someone saw them, a porter at Murphy's building, who recognised French from the newspapers, who understood that a man in French's position was worth money. The porter went to a journalist, and the journalist went to the Earl of Zetland. Here is where the story becomes interesting. Zetland had a choice. He could dismiss French immediately, weather the scandal, distance himself. That was the safe option. But French knew too much. 6 years of sensitive correspondence, names of informants, details of covert operations. French had drafted secret memoranda. He had met with intelligence officers. If French were dismissed and became bitter, if he decided to sell what he knew to Irish nationalists or to opposition politicians in London, the damage would be catastrophic. So Zetland made a different calculation. He called French into his office. He told him that he was aware of the situation with Murphy. He did not moralize. He did not express disgust. He simply told French that the relationship had to end. Immediately. Permanently. And then he gave French a promotion. French became Assistant Under-Secretary for Ireland, a significant position, a large salary increase, a public demonstration of Zetland's confidence. The journalist who had brought the allegations lost interest when it became clear there would be no scandal, no dismissal, no story. The porter was paid off. Thomas Murphy was transferred to a position in London, far from Dublin, far from French. And James French remained in Zetland's service for another 8 years. He retired in 1899 with a pension and the thanks of the Crown for his faithful service. This is the other way the system worked. When the secretary was too valuable to lose, when dismissal would create more risk than retention, the employer bought silence with advancement. The relationship ended, but the career continued. French never saw Thomas Murphy again. Murphy's later life is unrecorded. He disappears from the historical record after his transfer to London. He was 24 years old when he was sent away from the man he loved, because that man's discretion was worth more than his happiness. He probably died without anyone knowing his name. But tonight, you and I know it. Thomas Murphy, 24, from Cork. Loved a man who chose his career. That is all we can do for him now. Remember that he existed. The difficulty with studying these relationships is that the men involved spent their entire lives ensuring no evidence would survive. They burned letters. They kept no diaries. They spoke in code even when they thought they were safe. But occasionally, something slipped through. In 1976, a historian named Geoffrey Weeks was researching Victorian attitudes toward homosexuality in the archives of the Home Office. He was looking through police reports from the 1880s, boxes of material that no one had examined in decades, and he found a file marked "Private and Confidential, not for general circulation." Inside were transcripts of police interviews from 1887. The case had never gone to trial. The file had been sealed on the orders of the Home Secretary himself. The interviews were with a young man named Charles Ernest Thorne. Thorne was 28 years old in 1887. He had been private secretary to a man Weeks identifies only as Mr. H of Eaton Square. The file makes clear that Mr. H was a member of Parliament, though his full name has been redacted from the documents. Thorne had gone to the police with a complaint. He claimed that Mr. H had assaulted him, that the relationship, which had begun as consensual, had become coercive, that he had tried to leave the position multiple times and had been threatened. The police interviews are extraordinary documents. Thorne describes, in careful detail, the structure of his employment, how he had been hired ostensibly to manage correspondence, how within 3 weeks Mr. H had made it clear that other duties were expected, how Thorne, who needed the position desperately, his father had died leaving debts, had agreed. For 2 years, Thorne lived in Mr. H's household. He describes the routine with a precision that suggests he had rehearsed this testimony, that he knew he would only get one chance to be believed. He would work in the study during the day. Professional, efficient. He would dine with Mr. H and occasionally with Mr. H's guests, always introduced as the secretary, never by his first name. 3 or 4 nights a week, Mr. H would summon him after the household was asleep. Sometimes it was a request. "Would you join me for a brandy?" Sometimes it was an order. "I require your presence." Thorne described what happened in those late-night meetings in language carefully chosen to avoid explicit indecency. He spoke of familiarities and liberties taken. The police interviewer clearly understood what he meant. The transcript notes that Thorne was asked whether force was involved. Thorne said not physical force, but economic force. The constant reminder that he depended on Mr. H for everything, his salary, his lodging, his future references. His entire life was controlled by a man who could destroy him with a single word. And then Thorne tried to leave. He told Mr. H that he had been offered another position. This was a lie. He was simply desperate to escape, but he thought it might allow him to resign without incident. Mr. H told him the position would not be necessary, that Thorne's services were still required, that leaving would be unwise. Thorne insisted, said he had already accepted the other offer, and Mr. H said something that Thorne recorded verbatim in his police statement. "If you leave this house under these circumstances, I will ensure that no one in London will employ you. I will write to your new employer and inform them of your character. I will make certain that everyone who matters knows exactly what kind of young man you are." This was the threat that every private secretary lived with. The employer could destroy them with a whisper, a word to the right people, a letter that began, "I regret to inform you that Mr. So-and-so, while in my employment, demonstrated behaviours that render him unsuitable." No details needed, just the implication, the knowing silence. Thorne stayed for another 6 months after that conversation, and then something happened that he does not fully describe in the police interview. An incident, a night when Mr. H was drunk and became violent. Thorne left the house the next morning, went directly to the police station, filed a complaint. The police took his statement. They opened an investigation. And then, 3 days later, the investigation was closed. The file contains a single memo from the Home Secretary's office. This matter is not to be pursued. The individual in question is of such standing that public proceedings would not be in the national interest. The complainant is to be informed that no further action will be taken. No further action was taken. Charles Ernest Thorne disappears from the record after that. We do not know what happened to him. Whether he found other work, whether he left London, whether he survived. The file was sealed, hidden in the archives for 90 years. And Mr. H, whoever he was, continued his career, continued presumably to employ young men as private secretaries, because that was the calculation the Victorian establishment made, again and again. Protect the powerful, silence the vulnerable. The system depended on it. Let me show you how deeply embedded this was, how many people knew, how many people participated in maintaining the fiction. In 1885, Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act. Section 11 of that Act, known as the Labouchere Amendment after the MP who proposed it, made gross indecency between men illegal, even in private. This was the law that would be used to prosecute Oscar Wilde 10 years later. The law that made any sexual act between men a criminal offence, punishable by up to 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour. The debate over the Labouchere Amendment in Parliament was brief. It was proposed late at night, at the end of a long session. Most MPs had already left. The amendment passed with minimal discussion. But here is what is interesting. Several MPs who voted for the amendment employed private secretaries who were widely understood to be their lovers. This is documented in private correspondence from the period. Letters between society figures, diaries, the kind of sources that only survive by accident. These men voted to criminalise the very relationships they were living. Why? Because the law was never intended to touch them. The law was designed to police public behaviour, to shut down molly houses and brothels, to prosecute working-class men who were visible, who got caught, who did not have the protection of wealth and position. The law was not for gentlemen. Gentlemen had private secretaries. They had households where what happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. And if a secretary ever threatened to break that silence, well, the law could be used against him too, because he was the one without power. He was the criminal. The gentleman was merely the victim of an employee's immoral advances. The system protected itself at every level. Let me give you a specific example of how this worked in practice. The year is 1889. A man named Henry Fitzroy, younger son of an earl, is serving as private secretary to Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister. Fitzroy is 31. He has been in Salisbury's service for 4 years. He is known to be efficient, discreet, and utterly loyal. Salisbury trusts him with the most sensitive government correspondence. Fitzroy is also known within a certain circle to have a companion, a young man named David. a clerk at the Foreign Office. They are careful. They meet at David's lodgings in Bloomsbury, never at Fitzroy's rooms. They do not appear together in public, but someone sees them. A colleague at the Foreign Office who has a grudge against Fitzroy over some bureaucratic matter. This colleague writes an anonymous letter to Lord Salisbury. The letter describes Fitzroy's relationship with David in terms that leave no room for misunderstanding. It suggests that Fitzroy's position makes him a security risk. It recommends immediate dismissal. Salisbury receives the letter, reads it, and does nothing. 3 weeks later, the colleague who wrote the letter is transferred to a minor post in Cairo, effective immediately. Fitzroy remains as Salisbury's private secretary for another 6 years. He retires in 1895 with a knighthood for his service to the government. David remains a clerk at the Foreign Office. Fitzroy never acknowledges him publicly. But when Fitzroy dies in 1922, his will leaves everything, his estate, his investments, his personal effects, to David. By that time, David is 63 years old. He has spent his entire adult life as the unacknowledged partner of a man who could never say his name in public. The will is not contested. Fitzroy's family accepts it without comment, because by 1922, Fitzroy is dead, and protecting his reputation no longer matters. But David lived. He inherited a comfortable fortune. He remained in the same Bloomsbury lodgings where he and Fitzroy had spent 33 years of stolen evenings. And when David died in 1936, his obituary in the Times described him as a retired Foreign Office clerk with no surviving family. It did not mention Fitzroy. It did not mention that David had been loved. But he was, for 33 years, by a man who could never say so aloud. That is what it meant to be the companion of a Victorian gentleman, your entire life shaped by someone else's fear. Now let me take you inside one of these households. Let me show you what a day actually looked like. The house is on Grosvenor Square, 5 stories, cream-coloured stone, black railings, identical to a dozen other houses on the square, which is the point. Discretion begins with architecture. The master of the house is a senior civil servant at the War Office. We will call him Sir William, though that is not his real name. Sir William is 54, a widower. His children are grown and married. He lives alone except for his staff. His private secretary is a young man named James, 29, from a Shropshire family of modest gentry. Good education, good manners, no money. James has been in Sir William's employment for 3 years. It is 7 in the morning. James is awake in his rooms on the 3rd floor. His bedroom is small but well appointed. A decent bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk by the window with a view of the square. The walls are papered in a deep green. There is a gas lamp and a fireplace. Though the fire is not lit yet, the maid will come later. James dresses himself. He does not have a valet. That would be above his station. But his clothes are good quality, paid for by Sir William. A dark suit, white shirt, black tie, polished shoes. He goes downstairs to the breakfast room. Sir William is already there, reading the Times, eating toast and marmalade. The housekeeper brings James tea and eggs. They do not speak much at breakfast. This is professional time. Sir William finishes the newspaper, mentions a meeting at 11 that James will need to prepare files for. James nods, makes a note. At 7:30, they move to the study. This is where James spends most of his day. A large room on the 1st floor, overlooking the square. Mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk for Sir William, and a smaller one, positioned near the window, for James. The Morning Post has already been delivered. James sorts it into 3 piles, exactly as he has been trained. Urgent, routine, personal. Sir William opens the urgent pile first. A letter from the War Office. James takes dictation, Sir William's reply, which James will write out in fair copy later. A letter from a parliamentary colleague about a committee meeting. James drafts a response, shows it to Sir William, makes revisions based on his comments. An invitation to a dinner party. James checks the engagement diary. The date is free. Sir William says yes. James writes an acceptance and adds the engagement to the diary in his precise handwriting. By 10 o'clock, they have worked through the Morning Post. Sir William leaves for his meeting at the War Office. James remains in the study. This is when James does his real work. He maintains the filing system. Hundreds of folders, meticulously organized, containing copies of every letter Sir William has sent or received in the last decade. He updates the ledgers, expenditures, household accounts, charitable donations. He drafts letters that Sir William will sign later, and he manages the other correspondence, the letters that do not go in the official files. There is a locked drawer in James's desk. Only he and Sir William have keys. In that drawer are letters from a man named Robert, an officer in the Coldstream Guards. Robert writes to Sir William every few weeks. The letters are affectionate but careful. They discuss dinners they have shared, evenings at the theatre. Robert thanks Sir William for his generosity and continued friendship. James knows what these letters mean. He knows that Robert visits the house occasionally, always in the evening, always when the household staff has been dismissed for the night. He knows that on those evenings, Sir William asks him to ensure the study fire is well tended and that brandy and cigars are left on the side table. James performs these tasks without comment. This is part of his job. But what James does not tell Sir William is that he has his own locked drawer. In his bedroom, in the small desk by the window, he keeps letters from a man named Peter. Peter is a curate at a church in Clerkenwell. James met him 2 years ago at a dinner party. They have been careful. They meet during James's afternoon free time when Sir William does not require him. They walk in parks. They visit galleries. They have tea at Peter's lodgings. They have never spent a full night together. James cannot be away from the house overnight without explanation, and Peter cannot risk anyone from his parish seeing him in compromising circumstances. So they take what they can. An hour here, an afternoon there, stolen time. Peter has asked James more than once whether he might leave Sir William's service, find a different position, something that would give him more freedom. James has explained that it is not that simple. Sir William pays him well. More importantly, Sir William will provide a reference when James is ready to move on. That reference is everything. Without it, James would be unemployable in any equivalent position. So James stays, and Peter waits. And both of them understand that this is the bargain. Proximity to power requires sacrifice. It is 6 in the evening. Sir William has returned from the War Office. Dinner is at 7. James joins him in the drawing room for sherry before dinner. This is the time when they are least formal with each other. Sir William asks about James's afternoon. James mentions that he walked to the British Museum to look at the new antiquities collection. He does not mention that Peter met him there, that they spent an hour standing close together in a nearly empty gallery, pretending to examine Roman statuary, while their hands brushed against each other in the space between them. At dinner, they discuss politics, a scandal in the Liberal Party, the situation in South Africa. Sir William values James's opinion, asks what he thinks, listens to his answers. This is why James stays. Not just the salary, not just the security, but this, the evenings when Sir William treats him almost like an equal, when the conversation is genuine, when James can forget for an hour that he is an employee. After dinner, Sir William says he has letters to write. James returns to the study with him. They work in comfortable silence until 10. And then Sir William looks up from his desk. He says, "That will be all for tonight, James. Thank you." This is dismissal. James nods, says good night, goes upstairs to his rooms. He lights the gas lamp, sits at his desk, takes out Peter's most recent letter and reads it again. Peter writes about ordinary things, the sermon he is preparing, a parishioner's troubles, the weather. But between the lines, James can read the loneliness, the same loneliness James feels. They are both living half lives. James in Sir William's household, Peter in his church lodgings, both of them performing roles that require them to hide the most essential part of themselves. James thinks about writing a reply, but it is late, and tomorrow will be another long day, another day of managing correspondence, maintaining files, ensuring that Sir William's life runs smoothly. He puts the letter away, undresses, gets into bed. Downstairs, 2 floors below, Sir William is still awake in the study. He has taken out Robert's letters. He rereads them occasionally, when he is alone, when he can permit himself that small indulgence. Robert has not written in 3 weeks. Sir William wonders if he should write first, but that would seem too eager, too needy. Sir William is 54 years old. He has learned to accept that he will always be the one who cares more, the one who waits for letters, the one who provides generosity and friendship and hopes for something that looks, in dim light, almost like love. He puts the letters away, locks the drawer, goes upstairs to his bedroom. In the servants' quarters on the 4th floor, the housekeeper and the maids are talking quietly before bed. They know about James. They know about Robert. They know about all of it. But they do not speak of it outside this house, because their positions depend on discretion, just as James's does. Everyone in this house is keeping someone else's secrets. That is how the system worked. Mutual dependence. Mutual silence. And if you were very lucky, if you found a Sir William who was kind, who paid well, who treated you with something approaching respect, you could build a life that was almost tolerable. If you were unlucky, if you found a Mr. H of Eaton Square or someone like him, you learned that you had no recourse, no protection, no way out except to run and hope you were not followed. Most private secretaries fell somewhere in between. They endured, they adapted, they told themselves it could be worse. And they were right. It could always be worse. Let me tell you about John Francis Bloxham. Bloxham was not a secretary. He was a student at Oxford in the 1890s. But his story connects to the secretary world in a way that reveals how the whole system of patronage and protection functioned. In 1894, when Bloxham was 20 years old, he published a short story in an Oxford undergraduate magazine called The Chameleon. The story was titled The Priest and the Acolyte. It was about a Catholic priest who falls in love with a 14-year-old altar boy. The story ends with both of them dying by suicide after taking communion together, choosing death over separation. The story is not subtle. It is not coded. It is an explicit defense of intergenerational same-sex love written in gorgeous, decadent prose. The story caused an immediate scandal. The magazine was suppressed. Bloxham was expelled from Oxford. And then, 1 year later, Oscar Wilde was arrested, and the prosecutor at Wilde's trial used Bloxham's story as evidence of the corrupting influence of Wilde's social circle. Wilde had never met Bloxham, had nothing to do with the story, but the prosecutor did not care. The story was Exhibit A in the case that Wilde was part of a network of men promoting vice and corrupting youth. Wilde was convicted, sentenced to 2 years hard labour. Bloxham, who had written the story that was used to destroy Wilde, was never prosecuted, never even questioned by police. Why? Because Bloxham's family had connections. His father knew people. Strings were pulled. Bloxham was quietly sent abroad. He spent several years in Europe. When he returned to England, he became an Anglican priest. He lived a long, respectable life, died in 1928. The double standard is staggering. Wilde, who was famous, visible, who had made enemies, destroyed. Bloxham, whose story was far more explicitly offensive to Victorian morality, protected because his family had the right connections. This is what the private secretaries understood instinctively. Protection was not about innocence. It was about who you knew, about who had an interest in keeping you safe. If you were a secretary to a powerful man, you were protected as long as you were useful. The moment you stopped being useful, the moment you became a liability, the protection vanished. And then you discovered that all those years of loyalty, all that discretion, all those secrets you had kept, none of it mattered. You were disposable. You had always been disposable. The irony is that some of the most vicious enforcement of anti-sodomy laws came from men who were themselves living these arrangements. Let me tell you about Sir Matthew White Ridley, Home Secretary from 1895 to 1900. The man responsible for enforcing the Labouchere Amendment, the man who oversaw prosecutions for gross indecency across England during the height of the Victorian moral panic. Ridley employed a private secretary named Edmund Talbot. Young, Cambridge educated, from a good family that had fallen on financial difficulties. Talbot lived in Ridley's household for 7 years, from 1893 to 1900. He managed Ridley's correspondence during the exact period when Ridley was prosecuting more men for homosexual offences than any Home Secretary before him. The historical record on Ridley and Talbot is thin. No letters survive, no diaries, no explicit evidence. But what does survive is this. When Talbot left Ridley's service in 1900, Ridley personally arranged for him to receive a position in the Colonial Office, a significant promotion, unusual for a man who had only ever been a private secretary. And when Talbot died in 1932, his obituary in the Times mentioned that he had never married, had lived alone for 32 years in rooms in Pimlico, and had left his modest estate to a charitable foundation established in Sir Matthew White Ridley's name. Make of that what you will. But here is what we know for certain. Ridley signed the warrants for Oscar Wilde's arrest. Ridley personally denied Wilde's petition for early release. Ridley oversaw the continued imprisonment of men whose crime was exactly what his household appeared to contain. This was not hypocrisy in the way we usually think of it. Ridley was not secretly gay while publicly condemning gay men. Ridley was a Victorian gentleman. He understood that the law existed to maintain social order, and social order meant that working-class men who were visible, who got caught, who lacked protection, they were punished. But gentlemen like himself, who maintained discretion, who employed their companions as secretaries, who kept everything behind closed doors, they were untouchable. The law was not designed to punish people like Ridley. The law was designed to protect people like Ridley by ensuring that sexual behaviour stayed invisible, privatised, contained within households where servants could be controlled and witnesses could be bought. Ridley did not see a contradiction. He saw a system functioning exactly as intended. And Edmund Talbot, living in Ridley's household while Ridley signed arrest warrants for men whose crime was loving other men. What did Talbot think? We will never know. Talbot left no record, no journal, no letters that survived. He kept his silence. He received his reward. He spent the rest of his life in comfortable solitude, protecting the memory of a man who had prosecuted others for what Talbot himself may have been. That silence is its own kind of violence. Let me show you what happened when that silence broke. The year is 1898. A man named George Ives is running what he calls the Order of Cheronea. It is a secret society for men who love men. Membership is by invitation only. Meetings are held in private rooms. Members use code names. Ives keeps a detailed diary. He records who attends meetings, what they discuss. He is building an archive of queer life in London, convinced that someday historians will want to know that they existed. In his diary for July 1898, Ives records a meeting with a man he identifies only as CT. CT is 34. He has been private secretary to a Liberal MP for 9 years. CT tells Ives that he is thinking of leaving his position, that he can no longer bear the duplicity, that he wants to live openly, honestly, even if it means giving up security. Ives talks him out of it, tells him that martyrdom serves no purpose, that CT is more useful to their cause alive and employed than destroyed and unemployable. That visibility is a privilege of the wealthy, and CT is not wealthy. CT agrees to stay. Ives records that he seemed relieved to have been talked out of it, that he had wanted permission to remain in his comfortable prison. 3 months later, CT attends another meeting, tells Ives that he has fallen in love, a man named Arthur, a journalist. They want to set up a household together. Ives warns him that it is dangerous, that 2 unrelated men living together openly will attract attention. that there are laws about this now, that CT will lose his position if anyone finds out. CT says he does not care, says he has spent nearly a decade living in someone else's house, managing someone else's life, pretending to be something he is not. He wants his own life, his own household, his own love. Ives never records what happened next. The diary entries about CT simply stop. But we can guess. CT probably tried to resign. His employer probably asked why. CT probably gave some excuse, family obligations, health, a desire for change. And his employer probably refused to provide a reference, or worse, provided a reference that said exactly enough to ensure CT could never work in London again. CT probably left anyway. Probably tried to build a life with Arthur. And probably discovered that without money, without position, without the protection of employment in a gentleman's household, two men trying to live together openly in 1898 faced constant harassment, landlords who refused to rent to them, neighbours who complained, police who watched their door. Most couples like this lasted less than a year before poverty or pressure forced them apart. CT disappears from the historical record. We do not know his real name, do not know if he and Arthur survived. But George Ives's diary contains one more reference to him. In 1904, 6 years after CT left his position, Ives records meeting a man at a pub in Bloomsbury who told him that CT had died, influenza. He had been living in a boarding house in Lambeth, no money, no family. Arthur had stayed with him until the end, had been there when CT died, and then Arthur had disappeared, probably left London, probably went somewhere he could start over, somewhere no one knew him as the man who had lived with another man. Ives writes, CT chose love over safety. I respect him for it. I also believe he made a terrible mistake. This is the calculation every private secretary had to make. Stay in the comfortable prison or risk everything for freedom. Most chose the prison. But let me tell you about one who found a third option. His name was Reginald Brett, and he became the second Viscount Esher, one of the most powerful men in Britain, though most people today have never heard of him. Brett started as private secretary to the Marquess of Hartington in 1878, when he was 25. Hartington was a senior Liberal politician, a man who would later become the Duke of Devonshire. Brett was efficient, charming, connected. He managed Hartington's political life with extraordinary skill. He was also, quite openly within a certain circle, in love with his employer. Brett kept a diary. Unlike most of the men we have discussed, Brett's diary was not destroyed. It survives in the archives at Churchill College, Cambridge, and it is extraordinary. Brett writes about Hartington with an intensity that leaves no room for misinterpretation. He describes Hartington's physical presence, his voice, the way he looked when he was thinking. Brett writes about the agony of watching Hartington conduct an affair with a married woman, the Duchess of Manchester, and knowing that he, Brett, would never have that kind of claim on Hartington's affection. In 1880, Brett writes, I love him more than I have ever loved anyone. I know he does not feel the same. I am useful to him. Perhaps that is enough. It was not enough. Brett left Hartington's service in 1885, not because of a scandal, not because he was dismissed, but because he had figured out something that most private secretaries never learned. You could not get power by serving power. You had to take it. Brett married, had children, built a career not as someone's secretary, but as a power broker in his own right. He became an advisor to Queen Victoria, then to Edward VII. He was the man politicians came to when they needed something done quietly. He sat on royal commissions. He shaped military policy, and he never stopped loving men. Brett's diaries record a series of intense emotional relationships with younger men throughout his life. He was careful, he was discreet, but he was not celibate, and he was not ashamed. What Brett understood, what most secretaries never figured out, was that the system only trapped you if you stayed in it. If you could accumulate enough power of your own, you could rewrite the rules. Brett died in 1930, aged 77. He had outlived almost everyone who had known him as a young private secretary. His obituaries praised his service to the crown, his political acumen, his discretion. No one mentioned that he had spent his 20s in love with his employer, that he had built his entire career as a response to that unrequited love, that every position of power he achieved was, in some sense, an answer to Hartington's indifference. Brett's diaries reveal all of this, but the diaries were not published until 1934, and then only in heavily edited form. The full, unexpurgated diaries were not available to researchers until the 1980s. For 50 years after his death, Brett's public image remained intact, the brilliant strategist, the loyal servant of the crown. The fact that he had loved men was edited out of history. This is what happened to almost all of them. The private secretaries who survived, who built careers, who died respected, their queerness was carefully excised from the record by executors, by family members, by historians who thought they were protecting reputations. We know about Brett only because he was important enough that his papers were preserved, and because, eventually, attitudes changed enough that researchers could look at those papers honestly. But for every Reginald Brett whose story survives, there are hundreds of private secretaries whose names we will never know. Men who spent decades in service to politicians, bishops, aristocrats. Men who managed the intimate details of powerful lives. Men who loved and were not loved back, or who loved and were loved in secret, or who simply endured because enduring was all they could do. Their letters were burned, their diaries destroyed, their names forgotten. And the men they served, the statesmen, the MPs, the public figures, their biographies mention the secretaries only in passing, if at all. He was ably assisted by his private secretary, Mr. So-and-so. One sentence, that is all they get. Let me give you an example of how complete this erasure could be. Lord Rosebery was Prime Minister in 1894 and 1895, a liberal politician, fabulously wealthy, married to a Rothschild heiress, serious, intellectual, tormented. Rosebery employed a private secretary named Francis Douglas. Douglas served him for over a decade, lived in Rosebery's various households, travelled with him constantly. The major biographies of Rosebery mention Douglas perhaps 3 times, always in passing. Douglas handled the correspondence. Douglas accompanied him to Scotland. That is it. But if you dig into Rosebery's private papers, letters, diary fragments, notes, a different picture emerges. Rosebery wrote to Douglas constantly when they were apart. Not about politics, about ordinary things. How much he missed their conversations. How empty the house felt without him. How he looked forward to Douglas's return. In 1886, Rosebery's wife Hannah died suddenly. Rosebery was devastated. He withdrew from public life for months. The person who stayed with him during that time was Francis Douglas. Not family, not political allies. Douglas. Rosebery's biographers describe this period as one of intense grief and isolation. They do not mention that Douglas was there, that Douglas, in fact, barely left Rosebery's side for 6 months. When Rosebery finally returned to politics in 1887, he wrote to a friend, "Douglas has saved my life. I do not know what I would have done without him." This letter is in the archives, but it is not quoted in any major biography of Rosebery, because acknowledging the depth of Rosebery's emotional dependence on his male secretary would require asking questions that the biographers did not want to ask. Were they lovers? Possibly. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. But even if they were not lovers in a sexual sense, the relationship was emotionally intimate in a way that exceeded anything Rosebery had with male friends of his own class. Douglas was the person Rosebery trusted, the person he needed, the person whose presence made his life bearable. And history has reduced that to 3 mentions in passing. Francis Douglas died in 1900. His death is recorded in the Times, in a brief obituary. Mr. Francis Douglas, for many years private secretary to the Earl of Rosebery, died yesterday at his residence in London. He was 48. He never married. That is all. No mention of the decade he spent managing Rosebery's life. No mention of the months he spent at Rosebery's side after Hannah's death. No mention of the emotional bond that defined both their lives. Just, he never married. Which was code in 1900 for exactly what you think it meant. Rosebery lived another 29 years after Douglas died. He never employed another private secretary who lived in his household. He managed his own correspondence or relied on temporary staff. In his final years, Rosebery became increasingly reclusive. He stopped attending the House of Lords, stopped seeing friends. His biographers attribute this to depression, to political disappointments, to his complicated feelings about his legacy. But here is another possibility. Rosebery was lonely. The person who had made his life bearable was gone, and he had no language, no framework for grieving that loss publicly. He could not say, "I lost the person I loved most in the world," because that person was his secretary, a man. And admitting the depth of that bond would have required explaining what it was. So Rosebery stayed silent, and history stayed silent, and Francis Douglas became a footnote. Tonight, you and I are saying his name. Francis Douglas. Private secretary to Lord Rosebery. 48 when he died. Never married. Loved by one of the most powerful men in Britain, in a way that Britain's historians chose not to see. He existed. His love existed. And it mattered. Now let me take you to the very end of this era, to the moment when the whole system began to collapse. The First World War changed everything. In 1914, the structure of the Victorian gentleman's household still held. Private secretaries still lived in, still managed intimate aspects of their employers' lives. The rules of discretion still applied. By 1918, the world those rules governed no longer existed. The war killed hundreds of thousands of young men. It destroyed the financial basis of the aristocratic household. It sent women into the workforce in unprecedented numbers, which undermined the assumption that domestic service was the natural order. And it killed a lot of private secretaries. Young men in their 20s and 30s, exactly the age of most private secretaries, were the first to be conscripted. They died at the Somme, at Passchendaele, at Ypres. The men who employed them were often too old for service or occupied reserved positions in government. They stayed home, safe, and their secretaries went to die in France. Let me tell you about one of them. His name was Henry Cust. Not a secretary himself, but the employer of one. Cust was a Conservative MP, a journalist, a man about town, wealthy, well-connected, charming. In 1912, Cust employed a private secretary named Michael Llewellyn Davies. Davies was 22, Eton and Cambridge. Brilliant. The nephew of J.M. Barrie, yes, the Peter Pan author. Davies managed Cust's correspondence and parliamentary work. He lived in Cust's London house. They were close. Cust treated Davies almost like a son. In 1914, Davies enlisted. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Sent to France in 1915. Cust wrote to him constantly. The letters survive in the Barrie papers. They are warm, affectionate, full of advice and encouragement. Cust tells Davies to be careful, to write often, to come home safe. In March 1915, Davies was killed by a shell at the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. He was 24 years old. Cust was devastated. He wrote to Barrie, "I have lost the best friend I ever had. He was everything to me." And then Cust did something extraordinary. He published a memoir of Davies, privately printed, only a few dozen copies. In it, he described their relationship with an openness that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. He wrote about how much he had loved Davies, how their evenings together had been the happiest of his life, how he had hoped that Davies would take over his political work someday, that they would continue together for years. Cust did not say they were lovers, but the intensity of feeling in the memoir is undeniable, and Cust did not care anymore. Who knew? Because Davies was dead. and the rules that had governed how men could speak about each other. Those rules had died in the trenches too. The war created a strange opening. For a few years after 1918, it became possible to speak openly about love between men, as long as you framed it as grief for the war dead. Poems were published, memoirs, letters. Men wrote about loving their comrades, their fellow soldiers, with an emotional intensity that would have been prosecutable in peacetime. But because they were dead, because they had died for England, suddenly it was patriotic to say you loved them. This did not last long. By the mid-1920s, the window closed. The old rules reasserted themselves. Men went back to coding their feelings, burning their letters, maintaining discretion. But for a few years, the private secretaries who survived the war could read poems about men loving men and see their own feelings reflected in print. It was not enough, but it was something. Let me show you what happened to the private secretary system after the war ended. In 1919, a man named Philip Sassoon became Under-Secretary of State for Air. Sassoon was 31, immensely wealthy. His family fortune came from banking and trade in India. He was also openly, flamboyantly effeminate in a way that would have destroyed a poorer man. Sassoon collected art, hosted lavish parties, decorated his houses with a theatricality that shocked even his society friends. And he employed a succession of young men as private secretaries who were, everyone understood, more than secretaries. The difference was that by 1919, the old rules of silence had started to fray. People gossiped about Sassoon openly. Cartoons in newspapers depicted him in ways that coded his sexuality. Politicians made jokes, and yet Sassoon remained in government for over a decade. He was too wealthy, too well-connected, and frankly, too useful to be removed. The war had killed so many young men of his class that the ones who survived, even the obviously queer ones, were suddenly valuable in a way they had not been before. Sassoon's most long-serving secretary was a man named Rex Whistler. Whistler was an artist, not a trained secretary, but Sassoon employed him for years, officially to manage his art collection, unofficially as a companion. They travelled together constantly. Sassoon took Whistler to Paris, to Rome, to his villa in the south of France. They attended parties together, dined together. Society gossip columns mentioned them as a pair. And no one prosecuted. No one even really tried to blackmail them. Because the rules had changed just enough that wealthy men like Sassoon could be openly eccentric about their households and their companions, as long as they never explicitly confirmed what everyone already knew. This was not freedom, but it was more space than men like Edward Hamilton or Francis Douglas ever had. The private secretary role itself was also changing. By the 1920s, women were beginning to enter secretarial work in significant numbers. Typing pools replaced the single male secretary in many government offices. The assumption that a gentleman's secretary would live in his household started to seem old-fashioned. The intimate domestic arrangement that had provided cover for relationships between men was disappearing. And for men who needed that cover, this was a crisis. Let me tell you about a man named Edward Molyneux. Molyneux was a fashion designer, not a statesman, but his story illustrates what happened to the secretary system as it evolved past the Victorian model. In 1925, Molyneux employed a young man named Jack Peyton as his personal assistant. Peyton managed Molyneux's schedule, his business correspondence, his social life. He travelled with Molyneux to fashion shows in Paris, to fabric suppliers in Lyon, to clients in London. Officially, Peyton was an employee. In practice, he and Molyneux lived as a couple. They shared a flat in Mayfair. They appeared together at social events. Molyneux introduced Peyton to friends as my associate. This would have been impossible in 1890. By 1925, it was unusual but not quite scandalous. What protected them was money and the fact that they were operating in the art world rather than in politics or the church. The fashion industry had always been more tolerant of sexual nonconformity. Gay men and lesbians clustered in fields where talent mattered more than respectability, but the legal danger remained. The Labouchere Amendment was still law. Any sexual act between men was still criminal. So even the relatively open relationships of the 1920s required careful management. You could live together as long as you called it an employment arrangement. You could travel together as long as one of you was officially the secretary or assistant. You could appear in public together as long as no one asked too many questions. And if the police ever did investigate, if a neighbour reported you, if a blackmailer went to the authorities, you produced the employment contract, showed that you had separate bedrooms, even if no one ever slept in the second one, explained that business required close collaboration. The employment fiction still protected you, just barely. Molyneux and Peyton stayed together until 1940, when Peyton enlisted and was killed in the evacuation of Dunkirk. He was 37. Molyneux never had another long-term partner. He died in 1974, and his obituaries mentioned Peyton only as his longtime business associate. Even in 1974, 7 years after homosexuality was partially decriminalized in England, the obituary writers could not say plainly what everyone who knew Molyneux understood: that Peyton had been his partner, that they had loved each other for 15 years, that Molyneux had grieved him for 34. The euphemisms persisted long after the Victorian era ended. The secretary fiction outlived the society that created it. Now let me take you backward for a moment. Back to the 1880s, because there is one more story that needs to be told about how this system was enforced. I want to tell you about the household of the Duke of Clarence. Albert Victor, eldest son of the Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne. Clarence was 25 years old in 1889. He was considered slow-witted, lazy, possibly learning disabled. He had barely passed his military exams. The royal family worried constantly about what would happen when he became king. He was also, according to persistent rumours, sexually involved with men. The rumours were never proven, but they were widespread enough that the royal family took action. They assigned Clarence a private secretary, whose job was not just to manage his correspondence, but to manage him. The secretary's name was James Kenneth Stephen. Stephen was 30 years old, Cambridge educated, a barrister and writer. He came from a prominent legal family. He was exactly the kind of serious, respectable man the royal family hoped would stabilise Clarence. Stephen moved into Clarence's household in 1883. For 6 years, he managed every aspect of Clarence's life: his schedule, his public appearances, his correspondence, his social engagements. Stephen also, according to several sources, loved Clarence desperately. There is a series of poems Stephen wrote during this period, published under a pseudonym in a small Cambridge magazine. The poems are about an unnamed young man of high birth who is beautiful but intellectually limited. The poet describes watching this man, loving him from a distance, knowing the love can never be returned. The poems are heartbreaking. They describe a specific kind of agony: loving someone you serve, knowing you are valued only for your usefulness, knowing that the person you love will never see you as anything but an employee. In 1889, Stephen had a severe head injury. He was hit by a windmill blade during a visit to a rural estate. The injury caused lasting damage. He began having violent mood swings. He became paranoid, erratic. The royal family removed him from Clarence's service. Quietly. No scandal. Just a polite letter thanking him for his years of service and informing him that the Duke would be appointing a new secretary. Stephen never recovered from the dismissal. He stopped writing, stopped seeing friends. He became increasingly unstable. In 1892, the Duke of Clarence died of influenza. He was 28 years old. 6 weeks later, James Stephen stopped eating. He died of starvation. He was 33. His final diary entry, discovered after his death, read, "I have nothing left to live for." The Victorian obituaries attributed his death to the lingering effects of his head injury, depression brought on by physical trauma, a tragic accident, but anyone who read the poems knew the truth. Stephen had spent 6 years loving someone he could never have, someone who likely never knew the depth of what Stephen felt. And when that person died, Stephen had no language, no framework for grieving. He was not the widow. He was not family. He was the former secretary. He had no right to his own grief. So he starved himself. Because at least that was something he could control. The Duke of Clarence's biographers mention Stephen in passing. The Duke's former secretary, who sadly passed away shortly after His Royal Highness. That is it. Stephen's poems are in academic archives. Occasionally, a scholar will write a paper suggesting that Stephen may have had romantic feelings for Clarence. The papers are always carefully hedged. It is possible that one might interpret. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Even now, more than a century later, historians are afraid to say plainly what the poems say plainly. James Stephen loved the Duke of Clarence. He loved him desperately, hopelessly, completely, and that love killed him. This is what the private secretary system did to men. It put them in proximity to the thing they wanted most, and then made it impossible to have. It required them to perform devotion, while pretending the devotion was professional. It demanded intimacy while forbidding intimacy. And when the arrangement ended, through dismissal, death, or scandal, the secretary had no claim on his own grief. He was supposed to simply move on, find another position, serve someone else. As if the years of devotion had meant nothing, as if love could be transferred like a job reference. Most secretaries managed this. They were practical men. They understood the rules. They built lives that were tolerable, if not happy. But some could not. Some broke under the weight of it. And when they broke alone. Because they had no one they could tell the truth to. Let me give you one more example. This one from later, 1928. A man named Lionel Robbins was at the London School of Economics, working as a research assistant to a professor of political economy named Edwin Cannon. Robbins was 29, brilliant, on the verge of a significant academic career. He was also, according to his private letters, in love with Cannon. Cannon was 64, married. Utterly unaware of Robbins's feelings, or if he was aware, he gave no indication. Robbins spent 2 years working in close daily contact with Cannon, managing his research, editing his manuscripts, dining with him and his wife weekly, all while living with the knowledge that his feelings could never be acknowledged. In Robbins's private journal, not discovered until decades after his death, he wrote about the torture of this, the constant need to perform normalcy, to pretend that he was simply a devoted student, to watch Cannon go home every night to his wife while Robbins returned alone to his rooms. In 1930, Robbins left the LSE for a position at Oxford. He later said it was for professional reasons. But his journal reveals the truth. He could not bear to be near Cannon anymore. The proximity had become unbearable. Robbins went on to have a major career as an economist. He married in 1934, lived a respectable, outwardly conventional life. But his journal entries about Cannon continue until 1945, 15 years after he left the LSE. Brief, anguished notes. Saw EC today at a conference. Still feel the same. Read EC's new book. Remembered evenings in his study. Can hardly breathe. Robbins was trapped not by employment, but by his own feelings. And he had no way to escape except distance and time. By 1928, the Victorian household system had mostly disappeared. Robbins was not a live-in secretary. He had his own lodgings, his own independent life. But the emotional structure, the intimacy without acknowledgement, the devotion without reciprocation, that structure remained, and it destroyed him slowly, not dramatically, not in a way that shows up in history books, but it hollowed him out, made him incapable of real intimacy with anyone else for decades. This is the legacy the Victorian system left. Generations of men who learned that love meant suffering in silence, that closeness meant impossibility, that devotion required self-erasure. Even after the laws changed, even after the households disappeared, that psychological damage persisted. Let me bring you to the 1930s now. the final decade before the Second World War, and the true end of the world the Victorian secretaries had inhabited. By 1935, the figure of the live-in male private secretary had become almost quaint, a relic of an earlier age. Most government ministers used typing pools and female secretaries. Most businessmen employed stenographers. But there were still a few men, older politicians, aristocrats who had come of age in the Victorian era, who maintained the old arrangement. Let me tell you about one final pair, a statesman you have heard of and a secretary you have not. The statesman was Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister from 1937 to 1940, the man who flew to Munich to negotiate with Hitler, the man who returned waving a piece of paper and promising peace for our time. History has not been kind to Chamberlain. He is remembered as the appeaser, the man who failed to stand up to fascism, the man whose policies made World War II inevitable. But before he was Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then Minister of Health in the 1920s and early 1930s, Chamberlain employed a private secretary named Arthur Rucker. Rucker was 32 when he entered Chamberlain's service in 1921. Cambridge educated, civil servant, efficient, discreet, utterly reliable. He stayed with Chamberlain for 18 years, longer than almost any other private secretary in modern British political history. The Chamberlain Papers, held at the University of Birmingham, contain thousands of documents in Rucker's handwriting, memos, letters, notes. Rucker was present at every major political negotiation Chamberlain conducted. He accompanied Chamberlain to Munich in 1938. What the papers also contain, though biographers rarely mention this, are personal letters between Chamberlain and Rucker from the few occasions when they were separated. The letters are warm, affectionate. Chamberlain writes to Rucker the way he does not write to political colleagues or even to his own siblings. He shares doubts, worries, small observations about his day. In 1936, when Chamberlain's wife Anne was seriously ill, Rucker stayed at the Chamberlain house for 3 weeks. He managed not just Chamberlain's work, but the household, the medical arrangements, the stream of visitors. When Anne recovered, she wrote Rucker a note. "I do not know how Neville would have survived this without you. You are more than a secretary. You are family." Rucker kept that note in his personal papers for the rest of his life. Were Chamberlain and Rucker lovers? Almost certainly not. Chamberlain was genuinely devoted to his wife. There is no evidence of any sexual relationship, but the emotional intimacy was profound. Rucker organized Chamberlain's entire life, knew his thoughts before Chamberlain spoke them, anticipated his needs, made himself indispensable in a way that went far beyond professional competence. And Chamberlain relied on that intimacy completely. Rucker was the person he trusted most in the world, apart from his wife. When Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister in 1940, dying of cancer, Rucker was at his bedside. Not Churchill, who had replaced him, not the King, not most of the cabinet. Rucker, the secretary. And when Chamberlain died, Rucker organised the funeral, managed the correspondence, sorted the papers, performed all the intimate tasks of wrapping up a life. And then Arthur Rucker disappeared from history. He was 49 years old when Chamberlain died. He should have had decades of career ahead of him, but he never took another political position. He retired to a small house in Surrey, lived alone. His neighbours remembered him as a quiet man who kept to himself, who occasionally mentioned that he had worked in government but never specified doing what. He died in 1971 at 82. His obituary in the Times was 3 sentences long. Arthur Rucker, retired civil servant, died yesterday in Surrey. He had served as private secretary to Neville Chamberlain. He never married. That phrase again. Never married. The code that meant this man's life was shaped by relationships history chose not to name. Rucker left his papers to the University of Birmingham, where they sit in the Chamberlain archive. Researchers use them constantly to understand Chamberlain's political decisions. But no one has ever written a biography of Rucker himself. No one has ever asked what it was like to spend 18 years as the most intimate companion of a man who became one of the most controversial figures in British history. What did Rucker think about Munich? About appeasement? Did he agree with Chamberlain's choices, or did he argue against them in private? Did he watch Chamberlain make decisions that would be judged harshly by history and feel powerless to intervene? We will never know. Because Rucker left no diary, no memoir. He spent 18 years at the centre of British political power and then erased himself from the story. This was the final evolution of the private secretary, not the intimate companion of the Victorian era, not the live-in lover hidden in plain sight, but the invisible professional, the man who knew everything and said nothing, who shaped history from the shadows and then vanished. By the time the Second World War ended in 1945, the world that had created the Victorian private secretary was completely gone. The great aristocratic households had been sold or converted to schools and hospitals. Death duties had broken up estates. The servant class had disappeared into factories and offices, and the assumption that a gentleman needed a live-in male companion to manage his life had become a relic of a vanished age. But the men who had lived that system, the secretaries who had survived into the post-war world, they carried it with them. Let me tell you about what happened to some of them. George Ives, who ran the Order of Cheronea and kept those detailed diaries about London's secret gay world, lived until 1950. He was 81 when he died. He had outlived almost everyone he had known in the 1890s. In his final diary entries, Ives wrote about visiting the British Museum and seeing young men together, walking close, laughing, touching in ways that would have gotten them arrested in his youth. The world had not changed as much as he hoped. Homosexuality was still illegal. But something had shifted. There was less fear, more possibility. Ives wrote, "They do not know how lucky they are. They think this is oppression. They have no idea what it was like before." He was right and wrong. The young men of 1950 were still risking prison, still subject to blackmail and violence, still forced to hide in many contexts. But they were not living in the specific hell that the Victorian private secretaries inhabited. They were not trapped in households, dependent on the goodwill of men who could destroy them with a word. They had jobs outside domestic service. They had some degree of economic independence. It was not freedom, but it was more than their predecessors had. Ives died in June 1950. His obituary in the Times mentioned his work as a penal reformer and philanthropist. It did not mention the Order of Cheronea. It did not mention his decades of documenting gay life in London. It did not mention that he had spent his entire adult life trying to create a record so that future generations would know they were not alone. His diaries were sealed for 50 years after his death. When they were finally opened to researchers in 2000, they revolutionized the historical understanding of Victorian and Edwardian queer life. Ives had been right. Someone did want to know. Historians did come looking, but it took half a century. Edward Carpenter, who lived openly with George Merrill in that cottage in Millthorpe, outlived Merrill by 2 years. Merrill died in 1928. Carpenter died in 1929 at 84. In those final 2 years, Carpenter wrote almost nothing. He had spent decades writing about love between men, about the possibility of relationships that transcended class, about a future where people like him could live freely. And then the person he had built that life with was gone. Carpenter's final diary entry, written a week before his own death, read, "40 years was not enough. I wanted 50. I wanted 60. I wanted to die first, so I would not have to know what this feels like." Carpenter's funeral was attended by hundreds of people, socialists, feminists, writers, activists, people who had been influenced by his work, who had visited him at Millthorpe, who had seen in his life with Merrill a model for what love could be. But the obituaries, even the sympathetic ones, referred to Merrill as Carpenter's companion or housekeeper. They could not quite bring themselves to say partner, to say lover. Even in 1929, even for a man as openly queer as Carpenter had been, the language of acknowledgement did not exist in mainstream publications. The cottage at Millthorpe still stands. It is privately owned now. Occasionally, researchers visit, take photographs, try to imagine what it was like when Carpenter and Merrill lived there. The garden they planted is gone. The vegetables they grew, the bees they kept, the ordinary domestic life they built together, all of it erased by time. But the fact that they did it, that they managed to create 40 years of partnership in a world that did everything possible to prevent it, that fact remains. And it mattered. It mattered to the people who visited them. It mattered to the readers who found Carpenter's books and realized they were not alone. It matters now to anyone who needs to know that queer domesticity has a history older than marriage equality, older than pride parades, older than Stonewall. Carpenter and Merrill proved it was possible. Not easy, not safe, but possible. Now let me tell you about the ones who did not make it, the ones who were destroyed by the system they tried to navigate. In 1954, Alan Turing died of cyanide poisoning. He was 41. The official verdict was suicide, though some have argued it may have been an accident. Turing was not a private secretary. He was a mathematician, a codebreaker, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. His work at Bletchley Park during World War II helped crack the Enigma code and saved countless lives. In 1952, Turing was prosecuted for gross indecency after his relationship with a young man became known to police. He was convicted, given a choice between prison and chemical castration. He chose the latter. For 2 years, Turing endured hormone treatments that destroyed his body and his mind. He became depressed, paranoid, unable to work at the level he once had, and then he died. Turing's story is well known now. There have been apologies, pardons, films, monuments. His face is on the £50 note. But here is what often gets forgotten. Turing's case was not unusual. Between 1950 and 1960, approximately 1,000 men per year were convicted of gross indecency in England. Most of their names are not known. They did not get pardons. They did not get apologies. They lost their jobs. They lost their families. Many of them died alone, their contributions to society forgotten because their sexuality made them criminals. Some of those men had been private secretaries, had spent years managing the lives of powerful people, had kept secrets, maintained discretion, performed loyalty. And when they were arrested, the men they had served did nothing to help them, because the protection only worked one way. The gentleman was protected by the secretary's discretion, but the secretary was not protected by the gentleman's power, not when the law came calling. This is the truth that needs to be said clearly. The private secretary system was not a solution to oppression. It was a negotiation with oppression. It allowed some men, under specific circumstances, to live approximations of the lives they wanted, but it required silence. It required inequality. It required pretending that love was employment, that partnership was service, that intimacy was a professional duty, and it required throwing the working-class men, the ones who could not afford discretion, who got caught, who had no powerful patron to protect them, under the bus. The system survived because it protected the powerful and sacrificed the vulnerable. Always. Let me take you to one final story. This one from the 1960s, after homosexuality was partially decriminalised in England, but before social attitudes had caught up with legal changes. A man named Anthony Blunt was the surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, a prestigious position. Blunt was responsible for managing the Royal Art Collection. He was knighted in 1956 for his services to art history. Blunt was also a Soviet spy. He had been part of the Cambridge spy ring in the 1930s and 40s, passing British secrets to the USSR. And he was gay. In 1964, British intelligence confronted Blunt with evidence of his espionage. He confessed. In exchange for information about the spy ring, he was granted immunity from prosecution. But his sexuality was used as leverage. Intelligence officers threatened to expose him as a homosexual if he did not cooperate fully. Even though homosexuality had been partially decriminalised in 1967, the threat of public exposure was still enough to terrify him. Blunt continued in his position at the palace. continued to be invited to society events, continued to be treated as a respectable figure, but he employed a series of young men as research assistants throughout the 1960s and 70s. Men who helped him catalogue the collection, who travelled with him to examine paintings, who were present in his home constantly. Everyone in the art world understood what these assistants were. They were Blunt's companions, his lovers, the arrangement that Victorian private secretaries would have recognised immediately. In 1979, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher publicly revealed that Blunt had been a Soviet spy. The scandal was enormous. Blunt was stripped of his knighthood, his reputation destroyed, and the young men who had worked for him, who had been his assistants, his companions, they scattered. None of them wanted to be associated with the scandal. None of them wanted their names in the newspapers, their relationships with Blunt examined publicly. Blunt died in 1983, largely alone. His obituaries focused on his espionage and his fall from grace. They mentioned, in passing, that he had never married. The assistants, the young men who had shared his life, were not mentioned at all. They had returned to being invisible. Even in the 1980s, even after partial decriminalization, the structure persisted. The older man of status, the younger man whose presence is explained by employment. The intimacy that cannot be acknowledged. The names change. The decade changes. But the architecture of the closet remains the same. So what are we left with at the end of all this? Hundreds of names, some famous, most forgotten, men who lived in the margins of other men's lives, who managed correspondence and kept secrets and loved in silence. Some of them found moments of genuine happiness, Carpenter and Merrill in their cottage, Molyneux and Peyton in their Mayfair flat, brief windows where partnership was possible, even if it could not be named. Others endured decades of quiet suffering. Edward Hamilton watching Gladstone grow old, Francis Douglas grieving Rosebery in isolation, James Stephens starving himself after the Duke of Clarence died, and some were destroyed outright. Charles Thorne filing a police report that went nowhere. The men whose names were in Alfred Taylor's book erased to protect their employers. The working-class telegraph boys who went to prison while their aristocratic clients fled to France. The system gave nothing without taking something larger in return. It offered survival in exchange for visibility, proximity in exchange for acknowledgement, intimacy in exchange for equality. And for most of the men who lived within it, that bargain was the best they could hope for. But here is what I want you to understand as you drift towards sleep. These men were not passive victims. They were not simply trapped by circumstance. They made choices. They found ways to love within systems designed to prevent love. They built lives that had meaning, even if those lives could not be lived openly. They wrote letters that they knew might be burned. They kept diaries that they hoped might survive. They created records, left traces, refused to disappear completely. And some of them, Carpenter, Ives, Simons, actively worked to change the world that had trapped them. They wrote books arguing for acceptance. They created organizations. They documented queer life so that future generations would have proof that they existed. They were not just surviving, they were resisting. Every letter saved, every diary kept, every moment of intimacy stolen from a hostile world, every relationship that lasted decades despite impossible odds. All of it was resistance. The Victorian Statesmen are remembered. Their names are in history books. Their policies are studied. Their portraits hang in government buildings. But tonight, we are remembering the secretaries, the men who made those statesmen's lives possible, the men who loved them or wanted to, or simply endured proximity to them because it was the only option available. We are saying their names: Edward Hamilton, Francis Douglas, Arthur Rucker, Edmund Talbot, James Stephen, Charles Thorne, Thomas Murphy, and hundreds more whose names are lost, but whose lives mattered just as much. They lived in a world that tried very hard to erase them, that burned their letters, destroyed their diaries, reduced them to footnotes. But they left traces, and historians found those traces. And now we know. We know that queer people have always existed. We know that they found each other, even in the most hostile circumstances. We know that they built lives, loved each other, created communities, resisted erasure. And we know that the structures that trapped them, the need to frame love as employment, intimacy as service, partnership as patronage, those structures were not natural or inevitable. They were created by specific laws, specific social systems, specific choices that powerful people made to control who could love whom, which means they can be dismantled. The Victorian private secretary system is gone. The households that sustained it are gone. The laws that made it necessary have changed. But the impulse behind it, the need to hide queer relationships behind acceptable frameworks, that impulse persists in countries where homosexuality is still illegal, in families that cannot accept queer children, in workplaces where coming out still means risking your career. People are still making the same calculations the Victorian secretaries made, still weighing safety against visibility, still choosing survival over authenticity, and they are still leaving traces, still finding ways to love despite everything, still refusing to be erased. Tonight, as you sleep, men and women and non-binary people all over the world are living approximations of the lives they want, within systems that try to prevent those lives. They are finding each other. They are building communities. They are documenting their existence so that someday, when the world changes enough, historians will find the evidence and say, they were here. They loved. They mattered. This is the legacy of the Victorian private secretaries. Not the particular system they navigated, but the fact that they navigated it, that they survived, that they found ways to love even when love was criminalized, that they left enough evidence that we can tell their stories now. And that matters. Because every queer person who grows up feeling alone, feeling like they are the only one, feeling like their desires are aberrant or unnatural, they need to know that there is a history, that queer people have always existed, that they have always found each other, that they have always loved. The Victorian private secretaries are part of that history. They are part of your history if you are queer. They are part of the long, complicated, painful, beautiful story of how queer people have survived and loved and resisted for centuries. They were not perfect. The system they navigated was deeply unjust. It protected the wealthy and sacrificed the poor. It required silence and enforced inequality. But they were human. They did what they could with what they had. They loved when love was illegal. They kept records when records were dangerous. They hoped that someday, someone would care enough to remember them. Tonight, we care. We remember. We say their names. Edward Hamilton, who loved Gladstone for 12 years and wrote about it in a diary he kept hidden for a lifetime. Francis Douglas, who stayed with Rosebery through grief and never asked to be acknowledged. Arthur Rucker, who organized Chamberlain's entire life for 18 years and then disappeared into obscurity. James Stephen, who loved the Duke of Clarence so completely that he starved himself when Clarence died. Charles Thorne, who went to the police and was silenced. Thomas Murphy, who was 24 and in love and was sent away to protect a more powerful man's reputation. George Merrill, who spent 40 years with Edward Carpenter building a life that should not have been possible. Peter, the curate in Clerkenwell, who waited for his lover's afternoon free time and never got more. David, who inherited Fitzroy's estate in 1922 and lived another 14 years alone in Bloomsbury, with no one to tell that he had been loved. All of them. Every single one. The ones whose names we know and the hundreds whose names are lost. They existed. Their love existed. And it mattered. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of locked drawers, burned letters, and love that had to be coded as employment. Good night and sleep well.